Hey, welcome back to Mr. News Art Class. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces today. In this week's video, I want to talk to you about how to turn simple shapes into complex details. But first, in order to do that, we need to practice making some simple shapes. So go ahead and get your pencil and your paper handy and practice with me. Just like we talked about last week, I'm holding my pencil from the middle, not from the tip. And this will just allow me to get more variety of sizes and shapes with my pencil. The simplest thing your pencil is capable of doing is making dots. Notice that some of these dots ended up looking more like lines. Part of that's because my paper is a little bouncy, and part of that's because my hand isn't completely steady as I make those dots. Interestingly, this can sometimes give a very neat effect of movement if you're trying to go for that. Next, I want to practice making lines of different types. Not just different types, but also different thicknesses. And different values, darkness or lightness. And it's okay for all these lines to be on top of each other because this is just a practice. Notice how a dark zigzag line has a slightly different effect from a lighter zigzag line. Once you've warmed up with some basic lines, now we want to put some lines together to make some shapes. 1, 2, 3 lines makes a triangle. 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of approximately equal size makes a square. If they're not the same size, it makes a rectangle. Now, this isn't a math class where you have to be very precise about that, but we do need to know the names of the shapes that you would learn about in a math class. For example, if you have the top and bottom horizontal and the two sides diagonal, that makes a parallelogram, or if they're all the same length, a rhombus. If you have the top and bottom horizontal and the two sides diagonal, but the two sides are not parallel to each other, then this is what we call a trapezoid. These are important. We will come back to both of those. But before we do, some other simple shapes like circles, ellipse or oval, and some of these can be drawn in several different ways. For example, I could draw the rectangle horizontally. I could draw the oval horizontally. I could make with a triangle equilateral or isosceles, or a right triangle, or even a scalene triangle. All sorts of different ways to make those shapes. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Let's use these basic two-dimensional shapes put them together to create some three-dimensional shapes. You've probably seen somebody do this before, where they start with a square, make a couple diagonal lines, close them off, and they have a box. Well, if you look carefully, this shape right here is a parallelogram, and so is that one. So we could draw that again by starting with a square, adding a parallelogram, and adding a parallelogram. Notice that the parallelogram is a square in perspective. If I were to take this sheet of paper here and lift it up, the top part of it looks longer because it's closer to the camera. The bottom part of it looks shorter because it's farther away from the camera. This is only a very small effect on this distance, but if you had a very large open area, then you definitely see that things get smaller as they get farther away. For example, this rock here is bigger than these mountains off in the distance. Let's see that one more time, but let's turn that cube just a little bit to where we're looking directly at the front of it. So let's start with a square. Now, instead of adding two parallelograms, we're just going to put a trapezoid on top. Now this side becomes the front of the box, and this side becomes the top of the box, but we're looking dead on at the cube instead of looking kind of at the side corner. One thing that I love to do with these kind of boxes is find the topmost corners and drop some vertical lines down so it looks like you can see inside the box. Like the top of the box is open, and you could start putting things down inside that box. Next, let's move on to a completely different form. We'll start with a rectangle, except we're not drawing the top and the bottom because we're going to do something special. Instead of making straight lines for the top and bottom of our rectangle, I'm going to make an oval at the top and just half of that oval at the bottom. This makes a cylinder. If I do the same thing, but instead of having a circle at the top, I make these two lines come together at the top, like an upside down V, or like the top half of a triangle, but then a curved line, half of an oval at the bottom, that becomes a cone. Similar to a cone, I could also make a pyramid by starting with, again, the top being the same, but instead of making a curve across the bottom, I'm going to make a V, but I don't want it to be exactly a reflection of this. I want it to be more scalene, where this side comes off to the edge instead of straight down under the top. Then I'm going to connect from the top of the pyramid to this corner of the pyramid. So if you look closely at this whole image, it's two triangles put together. And now that we've practiced making some simple shapes and forms, either flip your paper over or move to another one, or if you have more empty space, just move over. And we're going to talk about how to use those simple forms and shapes to create a more realistic image. We'll start with something simple, then work our way up to a little bit more advanced. We'll go back to this trapezoid shape. We'll make that again, but maybe make it a little bigger this time. And let's imagine that this is the surface of a table. Notice that the bottom is wider than the top because it's closer to us. We're sitting at this side of the table. There might be somebody else over here sitting on the other side of the table from us. Now, our table isn't going to be paper thin, so we need to give it some thickness. How do we do that? We just make a very skinny rectangle right underneath the trapezoid. And that just helps to give a little bit of thickness so that the surface of this table feels like a three-dimensional object that you could actually rest your hands on. Next, we need to think about table legs, which usually come underneath the four corners of a table. Now, there's different styles of tables, but for the example here, we're going to use 4 legs, one from each corner. Let's start by just drawing some lines, some little guides, and let's make them all about the same length. And let's draw them right on top of everything else we've already got. Notice that these front 2 that are really close to us come down a whole lot farther. And these ones that are from the opposite side of the table just barely peek out underneath the edge of the table. If this is a glass table that I can see through, I could go ahead and draw the legs completely all the way there. But if this is a wooden table or any other kind of table that is opaque and you can't see through it, then I need to think about the rules of overlapping. This leg of the table is going to stop where it meets the bottom of the table because I can't see through this table unless I'm Superman. Same for this leg of the table. It stops at the bottom. The same is also true for these 2 legs in the back, and it makes it look, if all you're looking at is the bottom half of this picture, it makes it look like you've got really short legs on the other side of your table. But in perspective, they would be shorter because they're farther away, and things get smaller and smaller as they get farther away. Also, this top part of the legs is completely hidden. So let's go ahead and erase those guides that we made. And you've got a table. I could even go ahead and start setting a place setting here, like maybe a plate and some silverware. I'll start with the plate. Notice that it is not a circle. It's an oval. Because if you have something round and you turn it in perspective to where you're looking at it at an angle, it's going to become an oval. Now, a lot of people get that right, but here's what a lot of people do wrong. A lot of people, for a plate that's on this side of the table, would make it parallel to that side of the table. And that's not accurate. That would only be accurate if I was looking at it from that way, but I'm not. Somebody else might be looking at it that way, but I'm looking at the table this way. So I would still see this plate also as a horizontal oval. Same if there was a person sitting to my left. And if there's a person sitting across from me, I would also see their plate as a horizontal oval. And you can see how this starts to look like you're actually setting a table for dinner. If I wanted to get super fancy, I could also add in cylinders for cups. I could even start adding silverware, but watch this. Watch what happens if I add a fork and a spoon and a knife. If they're all just vertical lines like that, like you would think about, I'm placing my fork and my spoon and my knife perpendicular to the edge of the table. They're just perfectly straight up and down as I sit down. But perspective. Notice that the sides of the table do not go up and down. They angle in because things get smaller as they get farther away. So the fork, the knife, and the spoon should do the same. The easy way to think about it is anything on the left side of my plate is going to go the same direction as the left side of the table. Anything on the right side of my plate is going to go the same direction as the right side of the table. So my fork is going to angle this way a little bit. And my spoon is going to angle this way a little bit. And so does my knife. Now that's actually a little bit exaggerated. It wouldn't be quite that much, but you see how much of a difference that makes. Before, it looked like those forks and knives were sticking straight up out of the table. Now it looks like they're actually laying on the surface of the table. There's one more thing I want to show you, and you may have seen it in the introduction to this video, and that's this tree. I started that tree by making a simple cylinder. Now, does that look like a tree? No, but that's the basic shape of the trunk of a tree. Then I started adding branches by making cones that stuck out at odd angles from that basic cylinder. That still doesn't look much like a tree. It looks more like a cat toy, one of those towers that a cat would claw at and jump on top of. But that's not how the tree ends. This is what we call construction. These are the basic shapes and forms underneath the actual object. I know that this is going to be a tree, and so I need to think about what types of lines to use for that outline. Trees don't have straight lines. They're going to be curved and bent and crooked. They're not just going to curve gently and smoothly in one direction. They're going to be kind of bajankety. So I could even go practice some weird bajankety organic fluid lines. And then I could come back and let's maybe start with the tree trunk. It's going to get a little wider at the base than it is at the top. And then for this branch here, instead of having those nice straight lines, I want to kind of angle them and curve them out. Now I don't need to go in and erase this just yet, because you see how that sticks out? I kind of like that. I might want to use that as a branch coming off of a branch. And again here, I don't want this to be a perfectly straight branch. I want to give it some roughness and some curvature. And again, I can use that extra little bit to make another branch. And now here I think I want the trunk and this top branch to kind of merge together. A lot of times the trunk of a tree gets narrower as it goes to the top, so I can kind of think of this branch as just an extension of the trunk. But again, I don't want it to be a perfectly straight line. Maybe I make it wider here and get narrower up. Maybe I make another branch coming off. Maybe I see that there's kind of an empty space here, And I want to have another branch coming off lower down to the ground. And maybe it feels like there should be a little bit more thickness coming up here, because this tree trunk is still pretty thick right here, and then it just gets really narrow all of a sudden. So maybe the tree trunk keeps going up off the top of my page, and there could be another branch here. You get the idea. I could even come down at the bottom and start adding in some roots where they kind of go down into the ground. Maybe even a root on the back side of the tree going off into the ground. So I really like the way that turned out. Now I would eventually go back and erase this cylinder that's inside, but for the purposes of this video, just to show you, this cylinder right here was the basis of that whole tree. And then these cones were the basis of the first branches that I made. And I did the same thing to structure this tree. This idea is called construction. Start with the most simple, basic shapes, and then expand upon those and make them look more natural and realistic. And this construction idea is the way that almost every how to draw book is formatted. Every time you look at a how to draw book, it starts off with things like, here's an oval, and here's another oval, and then let's connect those ovals, and then let's add a little shape for an ear, and then let's make a snout a little longer with a circle at the end. And that's how almost every single how to draw book works, is through this construction method. And there's a reason for that. The reason is because it works. It's a simple trick that gets great results once you've practiced it. In next week's video, we'll be talking about value, which is lightness or darkness. We'll talk about how to shade and how to use value to make objects look three-dimensional. As always, I've left links in the description for all of the supplies that I used or talked about in this video. And those are affiliate links, which means if you use them, it directly supports this channel and it helps me keep these videos coming to you. If you want to be part of Mr. New's art class, subscribe for weekly beginner art tips on Thursdays and new Zentangle videos every Sunday. And thanks again for watching. I hope I was able to inspire you today.